it's Mo. It is December 8th, and I have finished 4 books so far in December, and it is time to do another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. These are videos that I do every month, except last month, where I talk about the books that I've read in the month, as close to when I've read them as I can. I try to talk for about 5 minutes about each book, and I tell you something about the book, and whether I like the book, whether I think you should read the book, etc., etc. You know, a book review. A vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. So the first book that I finished in December was The Case of Jennie Brice by Mary Roberts Rinehart. I love Mary Robert Rinehart. She is a Golden Age mystery writer, a queen of crime. She was an American author, though, which is a little bit unique for Golden Age mystery writers. I really love that she's an American writer because she often writes about places that I've been. This book is set in Pittsburgh, where I have never been. I would like to go to Pittsburgh, though. And this follows our main character, not Jennie Brice, but who is a landlady in a small apartment complex in Pittsburgh. In this area of Pittsburgh, it floods a lot. Pittsburgh is known for having quite a few rivers. And apparently, back in the early 1900s, this book was written in 1913, the area flooded a lot. So our landlady is dealing with the flooding. She's trying to keep track of all her tenants, and one of her tenants is Jennie Brice. And she hears Jennie Brice and her husband fighting. The husband goes out. There's like boats in the flood area to get in and out of the apartment complex. Later that night, she hears him come back, but the next morning, Jennie Brice is missing. The landlady starts suspecting that something has gone wrong, and she starts investigating what has gone wrong. And at the same time, someone comes to her door who is also interested in this investigation. So this is a very short book. I just recently got this copy of it at a used bookstore in Virginia, and I'm so happy I did. I really, really enjoyed this one. I think this is a great place to start with Mary Roberts Rinehart because it's so short, because it's a really quick and concise mystery, but a really fun mystery, and it has a lot of the elements that Mary Robert Rinehart uses, like the "if I had known then what I know now," or "we would soon find out," or "we didn't know this was going to be a clue, but it is" kind of language, as well as a little bit of a romance developing, and then also just the really strong characters that she evokes in a short amount of time. So I think this is a great example of Mary Robert Rinehart's writing. I've read 6 or 7 of her books now, and I would definitely suggest reading The Case of Jennie Brice. I don't think this is necessarily one that you can solve. I think you know who did it, but I don't think that you can solve like the intricacies of this particular mystery, but I'm fine with that. I like to just go along for the ride. It also has a lot of Rinehart's signature humor in it, and I really, really enjoyed it. The next book that I read in December was another Golden Age mystery. It was a Caribbean mystery by Agatha Christie. So December is the Cloak and Dagger Christmas and the Christie's Missing readathon month, and even though neither of those 2 readathons actually exist anymore, I still like to participate in them forever. One of them was started by Janelle at Two Funded Books, who sadly passed away. That was Cloak and Dagger Christmas, and the Christie's Missing readathon was started by Kevy at Say Kevy, who doesn't make videos anymore, but she was the person who introduced me to Mary Roberts Rinehart. So I always like to read a Mary Robert Rinehart and a Agatha Christie in December. A Caribbean mystery is part of the Miss Marple series. I'm working my way through the entire Miss Marple series in order, starting with Murder at the Vicarage, and I think this is the 9th or 10th book, depending on how you count the short stories in that series, and that means I think there's only 2 or 3 and then short stories left for me to read in the Miss Marple series. So I love Miss Marple. This one was a really interesting one because Miss Marple plays a very vital role in this particular mystery. Sometimes Miss Marple is an armchair detective, sometimes she's involved, sometimes she's not. And in this one, she is in St. Honoré, which is a fictional island in the British Virgin Islands or Bahamas, I'm not sure, in the Caribbean. She's there because her nephew has given her a Caribbean island tour, and she's hanging out at a resort there, and she's meeting all the people, and then of course someone at the resort is murdered. Well, dies, and then it's looking more and more like it could be murder. And Miss Marple gets to talk to all the guests at the Caribbean Hotel, and she gets to try to figure out and solve this potential murder. And of course she does. And this one is a good one as well for Agatha Christie because it does have a lot of signature aspects of her books as well. So like, again, a lot of humor, a lot of silliness, a lot of Miss Marple being a strange old pussy, as she is often called, or often calls herself. It has the local police not understanding or believing why Miss Marple could help solve this crime, and then being one-upped by Miss Marple, of course, as she does indeed solve the crime. So I really liked this one. I thought it was a great addition to the story. I liked the Caribbean setting. I like when Agatha Christie brings in elements of her travel and her life to her books, which she often does, especially in the Poirot or Miss Marple series. So you definitely can read this one as a standalone, but I think the Miss Marple series is good to read, if not in order, a bunch of them to get the feel for Miss Marple. I think kind of the one that I would start with would be Murder at the Vicarage, which is the first in the series, or I would start with A Body in the Library, which is the second or third in the series, but I think is more representative of Miss Marple in general. The third book that I finished in December was Winter Counts by David Heska Wanbli Weiden. This is a thriller crime novel about a man living on a reservation in South Dakota. He is a Native American man, and he is kind of the enforcer for this reservation. The reservation cops don't necessarily have a lot of pull or influence in the community. The feds are the feds and nobody trusts them, but also they only really care about things that happen on the reservation like murder or drugs, and the local police don't care about any of it. Our main character, Virgil, is the person that it kind of falls to get justice or revenge, depending on the circumstance, for people on the reservation. So if someone is abused, or someone is sexually assaulted, or someone is harmed, or someone is robbed, they might come to Virgil to exact revenge or justice for those injustices that they have suffered. Virgil doesn't really have a lot of other skills necessarily, so he sees this as a way to give back to the community. And there's a part of him, because he was bullied in school for being part white, and because he has never fully fit in, sees it as a way to kind of seek his own revenge on the greater injustices that he has faced as well. He is also taking care of his young nephew. His nephew is 14 years old, and his sister died in a car accident. His nephew was kind of left on his own, so if Virgil didn't take care of him, no one would. But other than that, Virgil is kind of a loner. He does have a best friend, he has an ex-girlfriend, he has a couple of friends around the res, but because he doesn't participate in the ceremonies and religious aspects on the res, he is kind of isolated as well. When a tribal council leader, who happens to be the father of his ex-girlfriend, says that there are drugs on the res and asks Virgil to do his thing to find these drug dealers, Virgil is at first hesitant, but when his nephew gets wrapped up in the drugs, Virgil decides to take on this issue. And then it's a pretty basic story, a pretty standard crime novel where Virgil has to do investigating and different people are involved, and of course like his bully from high school is involved, and of course his ex-girlfriend gets involved, and his nephew gets involved, and then we find out what is actually going on with these drugs and drug dealers on the res. So it's pretty obvious what's going to happen from the very beginning, and it's definitely not doing anything new, not doing anything exciting in the crime novel part of it, but I think the added element of the reservation And Virgil being an interesting character because he is, again, not fully one of the Indians, but he is obviously an Indian on the reservation. He is not a white person and does not have white people privilege. I think those added elements made this book more interesting than it would have been if it was just a regular old crime novel. I don't think it was doing anything exciting. I heard that this book was really like violent and really heavy with like the sexual assault and things like that, and those things are mentioned and they are heavy, but that aspect of the story is not even as pushed as far as many other crime novels would push it. So I think if you're interested in Native American culture and interested about stories set on reservations, which I definitely am, I think this is a good addition to those stories. Obviously, also if you like crime/mysteries, I think this is a good addition, but I don't think it's doing anything like revolutionary or groundbreaking. It was super easy to read. I read this one on audio. I actually read all 3 of these first books on audio, but since I'm doing my Read What You Own challenge, I'm trying to read books that I own that I also could read on audio. The next book that I finished in December is Absolution, a Southern Reach novel by Jeff Vandermeer. This is the 4th in the Southern Reach trilogy, which started with Annihilation, Authority, and then Acceptance. I reread all of those last month, so if you want to take a look at my last reading wrap-up, you will see my thoughts on those. Absolution is the longest of all the books and was written 10 years after he wrote the last of the original 3 in the trilogy. I was definitely disappointed by this one. I think that his writing is still really interesting and really strong. I think Jeff Vandermeer has a great way of evoking in the reader the emotions or feelings that he wants you to feel, right? I think he's really good at that, and I think that this happens. This book is broken up kind of into 3 stories and 3 different parts, and they are all connected. And they are all connected to the original 3 books. But because this is the 4th in the series, it's really hard to talk about the plot in this, especially because the Southern Reach series, I think, is best kind of gone in totally without knowing anything about it. I think it's better to not know. And I would say the same is for this. The only thing I would say is that maybe these 3 parts of this book should have been 3 novellas, and each novella should have been worked on a little bit more, and each novella should have been its own thing and put out as its own book, similar to the first 3 stories. The strongest thing about Annihilation is that it's very short. It's under 200 pages. It's super compelling. It's super fast-paced. It is compulsively readable. And then each book gets less and less. And this one was the hardest to read by far. Some of the literary devices or character devices that Vandermeer uses in this are almost intolerable. Some of them are repeats of things that we've seen before. Some of them are just really obnoxious to read from. So this was definitely a very difficult book. And then I would also say that no one edited this book. I mean, somebody must have edited it, but I don't know what they were editing for, because this book was far, far, far too long, which again is why I think it could have been split up into 3 different books and then edited better for each book. Also, I think that it just is repetitive. It goes on and on. It uses devices that he's already used. So as the reader, you're bored with some of the things. It isn't cohesive to the rest of the story necessarily. There are elements that interact with the other books that we've read in this series. And I don't need a book that has like a full ending. I don't need a book that answers all the questions that have been asked. But one of the nice things about specifically Annihilation and Authority is that they often ask questions and then answer those questions in the same book. Or they ask questions that were answered in subsequent books. And this didn't really answer any questions at all, and it provoked a lot of questions, but it didn't answer them even in its own book. And I just think there was a lot of repetition of word usage, a lot of just long words that people don't know necessarily that you had to look up, and then those were repeated a little bit ad nauseum, and it just felt very unedited. I think that as an author, he should have worked on these stories more, and as his publishers, they should have pushed him to work on these stories more and given him a better editor. So unfortunately, very disappointing. I did like this book. It's not that I didn't enjoy my time with it. I did. Even though parts of it were very frustrating and parts of it were very obnoxious to read. That was kind of the point of those parts, so I understand that he did a good job with that. But as a Southern Reach novel and as a potential conclusion, I didn't like it. It was very much like he took all the best elements of Annihilation and then took all the best elements out of it and just kept the worst elements for this book. So, like I said, as a book on its own, it's not that I hated it. As a Southern Reach book, extremely disappointing. So those were the first 4 books that I read so far in December, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is December 16th, and I have read 5 more books in December so far. The last book I talked about was Absolution. The next book that I finished after Absolution was The Spirit of Science Fiction by Roberto Bolano. So this was a short, posthumously published novel following Jan and Remo, who were 2 young men from Chile who, after high school, move to Mexico City. And they are both writers, they are both lovers of literature, but they take different paths once they get to the city. Jan works on his writing. He wants to write a science fiction novel, and one of the ways that he finds inspiration is by writing to other science fiction authors. But he stays in the house all day and becomes basically like a recluse, never leaving the house, never doing anything. His BFF Remo ends up going out, making friends, seeing the city, working for various like literary magazines and stuff, and in the course of that he finds a friend who is obsessed with the amount of literary and poetry magazines that there are in Mexico City at this point, like hundreds and hundreds, which they find very strange. So they together kind of go on an adventure to figure out why that might be. While all this is going on, we see letters that Jan is writing to various science fiction authors. We also see a book/dream that Remo is working on that he's describing to Jan, and we see how Remo's gaining friends and meeting people is affecting not only him and his life, but also Jan as well. So it was really interesting. It was definitely like an all vibes, no plot kind of thing. There wasn't a lot of plot. There was some things that happen. I wouldn't even say it was all vibes because it's not even vibes, but there were some plot aspects that happen, like Remo meeting Jose Arco, and like Remo falling in love, and like Jan finding love in some ways as well. So like there was plot that happened, but partly I think because this was posthumously written, some of the aspects of the plot don't really go anywhere. And this book is split up into 3 different sections, and the last little section, which is about Remo and his new girlfriend, like kind of just ends and doesn't really make much sense. I think that's not necessarily a spoiler to talk about, but I think it's worth noting because if you don't like books that don't seem finished, I don't know if you would like this one. The Spirit of Science Fiction is very much like a lot of other Latin American, Latinx writing that I've read of kind of a certain time or a certain vibe. This reminded me a lot of The Story of My Teeth. This reminded me a lot of, oh my god, I can never remember the name of that book. Oh, The Famous Magician, which I think was written by an Argentinian author. The language is very simple. The language is very plain. It's not overly descriptive, so you are kind of untethered from like time and space and place. And it is a lot about the interactions between people and kind of gleaning what those people's personality is like from the conversations that they have, and not so much from like descriptions about those people or explanation of those people. I kind of like that writing. Like I think that's really interesting. I liked The Story of My Teeth. The stories are also low on plot and a lot more meandering, and I think also have aspects of culture of the various Latin countries that these authors are from that I don't really understand, but seem apparent somehow in the books as well. Like, I don't know what the aspects of culture are, but like there seem like there must be aspects of culture. Does that make sense? I also think that this one was not finished, you know? So there's something to be said about like it not being complete. I did enjoy my time with this. I thought it was really interesting, but it almost felt like the start of something that was really intriguing, but it didn't finish. It didn't have a conclusion that was satisfying necessarily. Again, I don't mind that personally, that's fine, but I wonder if other Bolano books are a little bit more cohesive, a little bit more well-rounded and firm. And I would like to find out, and I would definitely read more Roberto Bolano. I read this for the TBR spin, so you can see more of my thoughts on this one in my TBR spin vlog. The next book that I read in December was Make Me Rain by Nikki Giovanni. Nikki Giovanni very sadly passed away on December 9th. I found out about it on the 10th, and that was the day that I go to my office job, so I wanted to read a Nikki Giovanni book, but I couldn't read it physically, so I picked an audiobook on my library app, and it was Make Me Rain, which is prose and poetry by Nikki Giovanni. This was written in 2020, so it does have a lot to do with the politics in America. Nikki Giovanni was a Black American poet, author. She also wrote a lot of children's books, who was originally from Tennessee and then moved to Virginia and lived the majority of her life in Virginia. She taught at various Virginia colleges, including Virginia Tech. This collection also has a lot to do with Virginia and her time there and her feelings about teaching a little bit. It was very heavily themed with food and the idea of food bringing people together, and also of food being a creative outlet, as well as a comfort, as well as a metaphor, as well as a physical manifestation of bringing things together and creating things and melding of different ideas and people. The other very heavy theme in this was quilt work. She mentions the quilters of Guy Bend, and she mentions just quilting in general, both in a historic sense and in a modern sense, and as metaphor for all the things that the food was metaphor for as well as like reuse and the idea of creating something out of nothing, and the idea of homemaking and taking care of your family as a job and as a creative outlet and as a worthwhile endeavor. So I really like that. It kind of solidified in my mind that I want to pick back up quilting, because I quilted for a very long time. Love Guy's Bend, love all the implications of quilting that Nikki Giovanni mentioned in this collection, but also just the comfort and creativity of creating quilts. And also, like, we use a lot of the quilts that I've made, and it's just so satisfying to make a quilt that has a purpose, but is also beautiful, but was also meditative, but was also a creative outlet, but then also use that quilt as something to keep you warm. Like, it's kind of incredible. So if you haven't quilted, I highly suggest quilting. And Make Me Rain, the collection, really inspired me to get back into it. I haven't picked it up yet, but I'm super excited to do so. I think every collection of poetry, you know, there's some that I like more than others, but consistently Nikki Giovanni's poetry speaks to me. It's funny, it's irreverent, it's emotional, it's biting, satirical, snarky. Like, I just love her poetry so much, and I'm very sad that she passed away, and was super happy to read this collection. I do think this collection is very topical and is very current, which a lot of her poetry was written in the 60s and 70s and 80s, 90s, etc. So like, it makes sense that this is more current because it was written in 2020, but if you're not interested in like more current poetry, this might not be for you, because it does talk about, like I said, the political climate in the US, especially now that we see some of the things that she speaks out against happening again and history repeating itself, it was pretty hard to read in those respects. But overall, I really enjoyed this collection. So if you like Nikki Giovanni, this is just one more that you should read. The next book that I read in December was Ghost Eaters, a novel by Clay McLeod Chapman. This is an ARC that I got in a little free library, and this book follows Erin, who we meet at a young age, like in her, I want to say like late teens, early 20s, and her little friend group. So she has a friend, Silas, who is kind of the leader of this group, and it's a repetitive thing in this book where she says, Silas says, like Simon says. So Silas says, eat this, and you eat it. Silas says, go here, and you go there. And the idea of this one charismatic person leading this small group of friends, Erin, another girlfriend of theirs, and another guy friend of theirs. And then we meet back up with Erin later in life. Her and Silas were an on-again, off-again couple, but when we meet her again, she's older. She's kind of trying to get her life together. She's had a string of boyfriends since Silas. She's always kind of been in love with him, but known that they shouldn't be together. And we see her trying to get her life together, trying to find more stable relationship, still being in contact with these three other friends, this friend group of 4 people still being very closely connected, but each of them having gone their own way to a certain extent. One of the things that has happened is that Silas has been in and out of rehab, has become a drug addict, and we see Erin at this point in life really being sick of picking up the pieces of Silas's life. And then the story goes from there. This book is like a horror book, so there's definitely some body horror in it. There's some like psychological horror. There's some like scary elements. I'm surprised more people don't talk about this book because it's one of the like mushroom books, which are so popular right now and have been so popular in the past. I thought this was just fine. I don't think it did anything particularly like amazing. I thought the characters were interesting. You get to like them. I like the little literary devices of Simon Says, and there's a couple of other repetitive things in there which Erin says and kind of give you a frame of mind of what kind of person Erin is, because she does parrot things like the Silas says, like things that her mother has told her. And so you get the idea that although she's trying to get her life together, one of the reasons that it's hard for her is because she is a follower. She is a person who will do what other people tell her. I don't know. It didn't do anything wrong. It didn't do anything amazing. It didn't do anything new. It didn't do anything innovative. But there were some scary aspects of it. There were some interesting things. There was some gore. There was some horror. But it didn't do anything right either. Like, I don't know. When I wasn't reading this, I didn't want to pick it up. I definitely almost DNF'd it. I was listening to it on audio, so I was like, oh, I can just read it in the back while I'm doing other things, which is what I did. It was fine. But what I will say is that I had another Clay McLeod Chapman book, and after reading this, I unhauled that one. So maybe that tells you something. I don't know. If you're interested in mushroom, if you're interested in horror, if you want to read a story about drugs, some of that repercussion, it was fine. You know what I will say was interesting about this book is it revolves around white people, and it revolves around drugs and the idea of taking drugs. Who's privileged enough to get off of drugs? I think it has a conversation about like people's families, found families and blood relation families, and who will help you and who won't when you are in crisis, when you are in drug crisis. And it did mention things like white privilege and the privilege of people who come from a moneyed background, even if they are not currently moneyed at the moment, and things like that. But it didn't go very in depth about like anything, so it didn't go very in depth about those conversations, but at least like they were sort of mentioned. The next book that I read in December was The Night She Died. I have the dust jacket over here. This is the first in the Inspector Thanet mysteries by Dorothy Simpson. I was so excited to find this when we were stuck in Virginia when our car broke down, because I've never seen a copy of this first Luke Thanet mystery. I have read quite a few Luke Thanet mysteries in the past, randomly, whichever ones I had. So I was super excited to see like the inception of Luke Thanet. These books are British mysteries, all written throughout the 80s and 90s, and I really enjoy them. I like the cozy British mystery vibes that they have. They're very much like Midsummer Murders or any of those cozy British mystery books / shows, in that, you know, a million murders happen in the same small town, in the same small area, and people are constantly murdering each other. Chief Inspector Luke Thanet is going around with his on-again, off-again, in this book, sergeant, lineman, and solving these crimes. A common theme of these is that the inspector and the sergeant like play off of each other, similar to the Morse books, similar to Inspector Lewis, similar to Midsummer Murders, similar even to the Dublin Murder Squad, some of the books in the Dublin Murder Squad, that the inspector and the sergeant have like an interaction. But I think that this one is pretty interesting because Luke Thanet kind of takes lineman under his wing and kind of inspires him to be a better inspector and like wants him to get a promotion and wants him to be better. And so that's a common theme throughout, and then the different things that happen to help or hinder Luke's idea of that happening for linemen. Another thing that I think is touched upon in other cozy mysteries but has a very big common theme in these particular books are Luke Thanet's family life and how much he relies on the love and acceptance and patience of his wife to get his job done, and how much he talks about the cases with her and how much she helps him work through what he's thinking in each case to be able to solve those cases, and also how much his family and his love and care of his family affects his work and often is the impetus for him solving the crimes. Also, how much he will not give up the love and care and time that he spends with his family for work. A lot of times in these cozy mysteries, you see the main detective always disappointing his wife because he has to go, or always missing things that his family has to do. And they're like, oh, well, that's just the life of a copper or whatever. But in this, he like really strictly makes time for his family, and it has like this very strong family unit, family message. In this particular book, The Night She Died, Inspector Thanet is called to a case of a young woman being stabbed in the chest in the doorway of her home. So could this be a robbery gone wrong? Yes, except nothing's missing. It happens to be that Sergeant Lineman is there already on the case, and this is the kind of start of Thanet and Lineman working together more closely. This is where you really see that Thanet has always liked Lineman, but now Lineman is going to be his sergeant and work with him pretty much exclusively. Of course, they're questioning everyone around this young woman, and they find out about another murder that happened very close, but 30 years previously. Are those two cases connected? You just have to read and find out. So I really love this one. It's only 188 pages, so super quick to get through, and I'm super glad that I read it. The next book that I read so far in December is Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. I read this one on audio. I have read all three of the Emily St. John Mandel books on audio that I have read so far, which are all in this very loose, connected trilogy of books. Will there be more in this series? Possibly, and I greatly, greatly hope so, because I love these books. So we start with Station 11, which is a pandemic novel, and then we go to The Glass Hotel, which I really love, but most people didn't like, and that has connections to Station 11 in certain respects, but it's more about like a Ponzi scheme and the people involved. And then we see quite a few of those people returning in Sea of Tranquility, which has to do with various timelines in the past and the future. So Sea of Tranquility takes place in 1912, 2020, 2203, 2401, and then also in 1918, 1990, and 2008. This is the only book that had multiple narrators, so each part of the book is read by a different person. I mean, sometimes they're the same people, for the same years, but you know what I'm saying. So this book is about multiple time periods throughout the past and history. We see some of the characters from the previous 2 books in this. It kind of revolves around multiple people having a moment in time where the world seems to shift and they're in a different place. Multiple people have experienced this where suddenly they hear something, they see something, and they experience something throughout these different timelines. So multiple people in these different timelines have felt and experienced this anomaly, this shift. So in the far future timeline, we see people looking back and saying, like, why did these people in all different timelines at all different places, for to a certain extent, experience this? And then the whole book is kind of an investigation of that. It's actually very short because a lot of the chapters are just a few pages, sometimes just a blurb. It's definitely not vignette-y. It's definitely a plotty book. It definitely has strong character development, interesting people. I love seeing the connections between people in all of St. John Mandel's work. I love that the connections that you get sometimes refer back to her other books. I thought this one was great. I think I liked, well, I don't know. I'll say that The Glass Hotel has stuck with me the most as far as remembering the actual plot so far. I mean, I just read this one, so I remember the plot of this one as well. But Station 11 I thought was great, and I loved reading it. This book I thought was really interesting, but I don't know if I would have thought that this book was as interesting if I didn't already know the history of Station 11 and The Glass Hotel. And then The Glass Hotel has like moments and aspects of the book that have really stuck with me. So I don't know what my ranking is. I kind of think you have to read them all together. I know people who have started with this book like this book the best, and I can see why. This is a really quick, really fast-paced, really punchy book, whereas The Glass Hotel is a little bit more like meandering, a little bit more nebulous, a little bit more confusing. This book has like some definitive answers, and I think Station 11 has some definitive answers as well. But so people I know have started with this one like this one the best, but I would suggest reading Station 11, then The Glass Hotel, then this one. I think at very least you should read The Glass Hotel and then this. Station 11 is the most far removed from those in time and plot and timeline and characters, so I would definitely suggest reading The Glass Hotel and this one as like a combo. I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait until Emily St. John Mandel writes more, and I hope that they are also all connected. So those were 5 more books that I read in December, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is December 28th, and I have finished 5 more books in December. The next book that I finished was The Red House Mystery by A.A. Milne. This is the author of Winnie the Pooh, and this is the one and only mystery that they wrote. So this was an interesting Golden Age mystery. I like that someone made a character list in the front, which actually really helped me while I was reading this. This is a Golden Age mystery in the vein of Sherlock Holmes specifically, in the vein of Agatha Christie, in the vein of John Dickinson Carr and other people like that. And it follows a group of people who are at the Red House and a murder that occurs there. We see a couple of different people in this book, but we follow one person who is a friend of the family of the Red House. So he happens to be around. He's a little bit of like kind of a layabout, kind of a man about town when it comes to jobs. So he's very, very smart, super intelligent, easily sees himself in different positions and takes on those positions and aces those positions. But currently he's like between jobs when he hears about a murder at the Red House, and he realizes that his friend had invited him to come and stay at the Red House. So he's in a pub like thinking, I could be a pub owner, when he realizes this and he ends up going up to the Red House. So instead of becoming a pub owner, he actually becomes a detective for the duration of this book and for the duration of his stay with his friend. He is our Holmes, and he makes like light of that, and he jokes that he's Holmes and that his friend is Watson, and obviously he knows that his friend can't possibly be involved in the murder, so like they make a good detective duo. There's some police officers in this, there's lots of different family members, cousins, and all sorts of people, and we see our Holmes and Watson going around interviewing people and talking to people and trying to figure out the mystery. I think the relationship between those two men is kind of what takes the most precedent in this book, and although there are a lot of closed room mystery tropes, although there is a lot of investigating going on, the actual mystery gets solved at the very end and it kind of just tells you what happens. So I don't really love mysteries like that, and I think that for a Milne, probably the relationship with these two people, which has often been like referred to as an older Christopher Robin, it was like the more important thing for him and the thing that he enjoyed writing more, or he was better at writing. So then the mystery kind of took second place to everything else, which is fine. I mean, I think overall it was a little confusing. There was a lot of characters, and because the mystery itself wasn't super strong, like the clues that you could follow, I felt like it was pretty anticlimactic that you just like found out at the end what happened. I did really like the relationship between the two main characters, but overall I don't think this was like a great Golden Age mystery. And it's funny because I just watched Criminale's Best of Crime books, or Best of Everything Else, and he put this as one of his favorite books of the year, so I'm really shocked, and it would be interesting to have like a conversation about that. The next book that I finished in December was Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. Kazuo Ishiguro. I have been wanting to read this one for a long time. I know that there's a movie. I knew that there was a movie out, and I've put off watching it because I wanted to read the book. Even before I like got back into BookTube and stuff, I always wanted to read the book before I watched the movie. So now I've read the book. This is the first Ishiguro that I've read, and this is a lot of people's favorite, I think, and a lot of people have recommended this book to me specifically. This book follows three main characters who all grow up in the English countryside in the 90s, and they all go to the same boarding school. So they meet at this boarding school, and this is a boarding school that you're at basically as a baby to your young adult life, like all the way through high school basically to your young adult life. This is all told from one of the women's perspectives. There's two women and a man, and this is told in a series of flashbacks and reminiscences of this main character. Her name is Kathy, as she's living her life in the present and thinking back to her time with these friends at this boarding school. And so she talks about her friend Tommy and Ruth and how they all met and the relationship they all had together and how that relationship changed over time. She talks about the boarding school, and she talks about the state of the world in the current day, where she is talking from, and also in the past where she is reminiscing from. I guess actually Ishiguro's most famous work is Remains of the Day, which I think is also about a man reminiscing to his time in the past, and you're seeing him like thinking about all those things and processing all those things on a train ride. And this is very similar. So this is Kathy reminiscing, processing, thinking about things, going backwards and forwards in time in her mind, and all about the story about these children. This is a pretty quiet book. No one ever told me that it wasn't, but I was still a little bit surprised that there was no like huge revelation. I've been pretty good about not being spoiled from the movie. Like, I knew that there was something about this boarding school and about these kids that was different, which I don't think is a spoiler to say because it's pretty obvious from the very beginning. But I did expect there to be like a huge reveal and a denouement of like, oh, revelation of what was going on. And that just wasn't the case. You kind of just knew it the whole time. It was very obvious what it was. Partly, I do think that's because I've read a lot of other books like this, and I've read a lot of other sci-fi books that deal with similar topics. If not like the exact same topic, seen many movies, watched lots of shows, read lots of books. But I did enjoy this one. There's something very, very captivating about the writing, and you feel very close to Kathy, Ruth, and Tommy. You really want to find out the future of their relationships. You really want to find out how their lives end up. You become invested in their lives, even if there's no like shocking moment or thrilling reveal. I can see why people don't like this one, especially because I think it is hyped as, you know, a shocking twist, which there just was not a shocking twist in this. But I did really enjoy it, and I would recommend it, especially if you like quiet books. The next book that I finished in December was A Coney Island of the Mind, poems by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. This is a book of poetry by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Lawrence Ferlinghetti was a writer, an activist, a bookstore owner. He is very well known for publishing Howl for the first time by Allen Ginsberg, and he was put on trial saying that that was an obscene book and da-da-da-da. On his own and in his circles, he's well known for his poetry and other books as well. So this is his most notable work of poetry, I think, but it does contain like kind of 3 sections of poetry. The first one is specific to this book, and then the second one is long poems that go with like jazz accompaniments. And then the third part is something that's been published before. He is experimenting a lot with visually and lyrically how poems are written, what they look like, how they are to be read, such as the sections with the jazz. He was inspired by T.S. Eliot and a lot of other poetry that he read when he was younger, but then also by the poets, the beats that were in his circle at the time of writing. He would definitely say he was not a beat and has in interviews, but he definitely is like a proto-beat or a pre-beat or a adjacent beat, and some people think of him as part of the beat generation. I really like these poems. It took me a little while to get into these. I bought this quite a few years ago, and I've tried to pick it up a couple of times, but when I did get into it, I did like it. I do think that there were some things that went over my head. There's a lot of literary reference in this work of poetry that I don't have the reference for. I don't know. So those kind of went over my head, and then just some very male ideas that I didn't necessarily get. These poems felt very like manly, very male to me. For the most part, I enjoyed a lot of them. The next book that I finished in December is The Golden Spoon by Jessa Maxwell. I've heard only bad things about this, and I think that that influenced me because when I first started reading this, I really, really wanted to DNF it. But I decided to stick with it, partly because I was reading it on audio, I was listening to it at 2 times speed, it was going by really quickly, partly because I had like a whole day of work to get through, so I figured I might as well just read it, and I could read it basically in that whole day, partly because I love this cover, I do love it, and partly because I did want to see what the hype was about, or I should say what the anti-hype was about. This book follows a bunch of people who are selected to be on a baking contest show, you know, similar to the Great British Bake Off or any of those reality TV contest shows, which I don't watch. I think the last show that I watched like that was like Iron Chef. I think that's what it was. That's how long ago it was. Maybe that show's still on. I have no idea. I hate reality TV. Right off the bat, I don't like reality TV. I don't have any reference of knowledge really for those kind of shows. I don't like those kind of shows. But I love Vermont, and this takes place in Vermont. It takes place specifically in Grafton, Vermont, which I've been to, which is a real place. It does take place at Grafton Manor, which I don't think is a real place. But we're following the host of the show, who is the lady of Grafton Manor, and her family lived there her whole life, and they had been rich but fell on hard times, and it's very hard now for her to keep up the manor. She decided to start this show. She is a famous baker, and she got a lot of acclaim for her baking. Doing this show is what really supports her and the manor. We don't see the perspective of the co-host or the producer or the cameraman, but they're around. And then the other perspectives that we do get are the contestants in the show. So Stella, a bunch of different people, Betsy, and they all have different reasons for joining this show, The Golden Spoon. They all have different backstories. They all have things in their past that they're thinking about, and we see some of them get eliminated right away and go home. We see some of them get eliminated and stick around. We see relationships growing and blossoming or falling apart depending on who they are. And right at the first chapter, we do see the death that's in this book. We don't know who it is right away. We can assume pretty early on who it's going to be. Then we don't hear about it again until like the last couple of chapters of the book. So there are mysteries that are happening, but the murder is not the main mystery. This is definitely a cozy mystery, and I could see why so many people would like this. I just don't think it was particularly well written, and then I don't think it was for me in other respects, because I don't like reality TV, because I don't like multiple narrators, because I thought it was extremely obvious what was happening, and there was a couple of little twists and turns that maybe I didn't know, but I didn't care enough about the mysteries or the story to care, you know? So like, is it a twist if you don't care what happens? Like, maybe not. Again though, I can see why cozy mystery lovers, and especially people who like The Great British Bake Off and other shows like that, could really like this one. And there were some like cute connections that were made, and there were some cute relationships that came into being, and there was like a cute like final epilogue or whatever. It wasn't as bad as I originally thought it was going to be, but it wasn't good. Lastly, so far in December, I finished the Christmas card Crime and Other Stories. This is edited by Martin Edwards and contains stories from Baroness Orski, Donald Knox, Carter Dixon, John Bood, and a bunch of other Golden Age mystery writers. Golden Age mystery writers, before Golden Age mystery writers, and after Golden Age mystery writers. I will say that I DNF'd the first story, which was the Baroness Orczy story. I have never read any Baroness Orczy. She's most famous for The Scarlet Pimpernel, which is an adventure story which like Batman was based on. It's not that I didn't like that first story, it's just that it was very flowery language and I was having a really hard time getting a foothold of it. I read this completely out of order. I just read whichever stories I wanted to read, and I really loved some of them. I thought By the Sword was really interesting because it switched perspectives and it was hard to tell who you were supposed to root for at first. I thought the titular story, The Christmas Card Crime by Donald Stewart, was really, really strong, probably the strongest of the stories that I read. I liked the Carter Dixon story, which was very short. A bunch of these I thought were great, and I love these British library crime classics, so I'm always happy to have read another one of these. This also fulfilled the last prompt that I'm going to do for Books and Lala's Buzzword Readathon 2024, which was a holiday word, so Christmas, obviously, or Christmas card if you want to do that. So those were the next 5 books that I finished. I probably will finish a couple more books, I hope, and when I do, I will come back to you. It is January 4th, and I finished one last book. The last book that I finished in December of 2024 is The Cloisters by Katie Hayes. I don't know why, but I keep saying Katie Mays. This is a mystery, sort of a cozy mystery, I guess, but also kind of a character study, sort of a young girl who has graduated from college with very little prospects. She comes from a small college in Washington State. Just before the year ended, she had a very tragic event where her father died, and she's still grappling with that. She also didn't get into any grad programs that she was looking into. She also didn't get hired by any organizations that she was hoping to get hired for, so she does eventually get an in with someone at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and they get her like a very small intern, and she figures out how to get a little sublet and like whatever. It's not her ideal, but at least it's something, and at least it gets her out of her small town in Washington. When she gets to the Metropolitan Museum, she finds out that there is no position for her. She's gonna have to turn around, go back to Washington, but luckily, as she's talking to the employment coordinator, a person from the Cloisters, which is a museum that's like set up like a medieval castle, a cloister, comes in and says that they need someone. So so they end up hiring her and she ends up working at the cloisters. So luckily for her, she gets to stay in New York, and then while she's at the cloisters, she's researching ancient texts and artwork. She loves it, it's gorgeous, it's amazing, and she meets people at the cloisters like the man that she's working for, who is the curator of the museum, another woman who's working for him between college and grad school, and a gardener there. And as they are all getting to know each other and as things are unfolding, our main character is also realizing that there might be more than meets the eye at this establishment, but also more reason for her to have been there than she originally thought. And this all kind of revolves loosely around tarot and a tarot deck. That's one of the things that they're studying. So tarot and the idea of fate and the idea of predetermined destinies definitely plays into this book. This book was like, okay. It wasn't thrilling. It wasn't super mysterious. It wasn't a great character study. I didn't love any of the people necessarily, but it becomes a little bit of a story of like obsession, how people with obsessions might pull strings to get what they want, and is that destiny because it was destined to happen, or is that a man-made, self-made prophecy? I didn't hate it, certainly. I didn't love it. I think it was interesting. I did really enjoy the descriptions of New York and the cloisters. This is obviously written by someone who knows the cloisters, has been there, loves it. I couldn't tell if it was someone who like lived in New York, someone who was a regular at the cloisters, or if it was just someone who became enamored of it and wanted to write a book set in that location. I would definitely read more by this author. There was a twist or two in this story. Some of them were very, very obvious, and some of them were a little less so obvious, but I think the kind of major twist comes very much at the end of the book, and then you don't really get a lot of time to digest it or sit with it. So I feel like the pacing of this book was very strange. If it had been maybe a little longer and a little bit more of a slow burn, and we saw a little bit more into the psychological aspects of the different characters, it could have been better. Or maybe if it had been shorter and it had been more like a quick novella, maybe it could have been better. I also feel like if it had more to do with the actual tarot and the idea of tarot, that would have been better. But overall, I thought it was interesting and totally unoffensive. Similar to The Golden Spoon, which I liked a lot less than this one. It was like not so much of a mystery, not so much of a thriller, but it had an interesting concept and it could have been executed better and done really well. But with both of those books, I think I would read more from the authors because there is the potential for them to become better writers. I know that Katie Hayes does have a book coming out. I keep seeing it on Goodreads giveaways, and I haven't entered them because, one, the premise is not super, super interesting to me the way this one was, and two, I hadn't read this one yet, so I wanted to make sure that I even kind of semi-enjoyed their writing before I entered a giveaway. I'm not going to enter that giveaway. I'm not going to pick up that book unless I see it at like a little free library. If you're interested in books set in New York or anything to do with tarot, I also liked that aspect of The Death of Mrs. Westaway. I didn't like that book. I like that book less than this book. It made less sense than this book. It had not as fun twists as this book. I do think it was more thrilling than this book. So I would suggest if you like that one, you might like this one. If you have connection to the cloisters or Upper Manhattan, you might like this one. Overall, it was okay. So those were all the books that I read in December. I mean, December is always a time where I read a lot of mysteries in general, so I was super excited for that. I read an Agatha Christie, I read a Mary Roberts Rinehart, I read, this is not one of those, I read some Golden Age mysteries, I read some other mysteries, which was fun. I read a modern classic, I read some poetry, I read some horror, which wasn't really horror. Oh, this is another mystery that I read. And then I also read a Nikki Giovanni poetry and prose, which is exciting. Oh, I read Absolution, which I don't have. I read a lot of like sci-fi things, which is interesting. I would say even some like occult things. A varied reading month. 2024 was a really interesting reading year. I do want to make some reflections on that, so look forward to that coming soon. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here. Let me know what you thought of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!